That one is called Utsu Eitza. Cats is Unplugged #3 album, the songs of Shlomo Carlebach. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Sorry I was a couple minutes late, had some technical difficulty. Who is with us? Nancy in North Carolina, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Ruth in Kentucky, Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Paul in Chicago, Guy in Ohio, Paul in the Great Northwest, Diana in New York, Shandor in the Bronx, Gisette in Colorado, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Gwen, I forget where. So glad to have you with us. Diana, Sal, I recently learned you're from Argentina. No, de Chile. Nina's from Argentina, pero mucho gusto, Diana. Great to have you with us from Colombia. Eliseo in Rosemead, California. Rebecca in LA. Over here on the YouTube side, Ifa in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily, and this shofar blast dedicated by our own Sharon Fran Brooks. Please dedicate a shofar blast for the yard site of my grandmother, Tila Frant, today on the 4th of Elul, and my uncle Jacob Frant and my mother Frida Frant on the 5th of Elul. Right? In Judaism, we like birthdays, but we really take the yard site seriously. When a person completes his life or her life, the day they leave this world, that's the yard site, and we honor that date on the calendar every year after that. And there's a special energy on the yard site of your loved ones. And when we honor them and when we do a mitzvah in their honor by giving tzedakah, giving charity to an organization like this one that shares Torah with people around the world, it lifts them even a little bit higher in the world of souls. So Sharon, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And this shofar blast is for your loved ones, Tilla, Jacob, and Frida. May their memories always be for a blessing. Let's learn. We have a beautiful daf today. We are on page Nun Vav, page 56 here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud, the laws of marriage contracts. We are in chapter 5, continuing our discussion of the first Mishnah in chapter 5. The Mishnah states basically that you cannot reduce the minimum amount of the marriage contract. Rabbi Yehuda says you can. Rabbi Meir says you cannot. A woman cannot waive her right to receive less than the minimum amount that the sages stipulated: 200 dinars for a virgin, 100 dinars for a non-virgin. However, the husband can promise as much more, beyond the minimum amount, beyond the standard amount as he wants. And that amount that he promises in the marriage contract gets fused with that minimum amount. We had a dispute yesterday that we were looking at. When does she become entitled to the full amount? Meaning if they wrote the marriage contract at the time of betrothal, and then he gave her a bill of divorce before they became married, or he died before they became fully married, does he owe the full amount? That was a dispute. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says she collects the full amount only if they're divorced or he dies after they're fully married. But the rabbis who disagree with him say no, she becomes entitled to the full amount even if he dies during the betrothal period. And there were a lot of opinions on both sides of that question. All right, we picked this up a few paragraphs into page 56a. Since the practical halacha, the practical law, meaning in practice, is that a woman who's divorced or widowed after betrothal receives the main sum of her marriage contract, but not the additional sum, meaning the law is like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So Ravin asks, what is the law with regard to a woman who entered the wedding canopy and is then widowed or divorced without having had sexual intercourse? I mean, if you actually picture what happened there, you can see why this is probably a hypothetical, but it would be such a tragedy. So they became betrothed, and he wrote the marriage contract. Ancient times, that could be as much as a year before the wedding. So then the wedding arrives, and the bride and groom step under the chuppah, the wedding canopy. They exchange vows, the gift, the ring. You are consecrated to me under the laws of Moses in Israel. And before they could get to their hotel room for the wedding night, something went wrong. Either he died, God forbid, or they decided to divorce. Between the wedding canopy and the first time that they consummate the marriage, they got divorced or he died. Terrible. But the question is, do we consider that she is like a woman who was betrothed, got a marriage contract, and then never made it to the wedding to consummate the union, and so she only receives the minimum amount, the standard amount, or if he promised, a larger amount that got fused in with that amount, but she stood under the wedding canopy and they didn't consummate the union, does she get the full amount, the extra amount that he promised, or does she not? That's the question being asked. Does the affection manifest in the wedding, meaning they stood under the chuppah, they stood in front of all their loved ones and guests and got married? You would think, well, they're fully married, aren't they? Whether they actually made it to consummation of the union or not. Does the affection manifest in the wedding, effect the marriage, right? They're now fully married, and therefore she receives the additional sum as a married woman? Or is it the affection manifest in the intercourse that actually affects the marriage, and consequently this woman is no different than a betrothed woman for the purpose of this law, and she would only be entitled to the standard amount and not the extra amounts. So come in here that Rav Yosef taught the following baraisa. He wrote, the additional sum in the marriage contract for her on account of the affection characteristic of the first night of marriage. So the Gemara, so that would seem to indicate that no, they didn't make it to the marriage bed, so it's like she's still betrothed. She hasn't fully entered the marriage state. So the Gemara asks, granted, if you say that the affection manifest in the wedding affects the marriage, so this is why it says the affection characteristic of the first night, as the wedding ceremony is performed on the first night only. But if you say the affection manifest in the intercourse affects the marriage, is there intercourse only on the first night? And then from this point forward, there is none? Obviously not. Consequently, the Baraisa implies that the affection manifest in the wedding affects the marriage, and from that point on, she is entitled to the additional sum of the marriage contract. Right? So they're reading Rav Yosef's Baraisa that it's the affection of the wedding night that fully makes her married, which would seem to say in our case that's being posited in the Gemara that she stood under the canopy but didn't make it to the marriage bed. That even so, it's like they're fully married because the affection of the wedding night includes the canopy and the marriage bed. And as long as they made it to the canopy, it's like, we've witnessed the affection of the bride and groom, and she should be considered fully married. But the Gemara rejects this as a proof that she's fully married. But rather, what is the advantage of interpreting the expression affection characteristic of the first night as a reference to a wedding? Is there a wedding only at night and not during the day? People get married during the day. And the Gemara responds, and according to your reasoning, is there intercourse only at night and not during the day? Are you going to make a distinction between the affection of the wedding night and say, well, the night implies wedding and intercourse, and if you did either one, they're fully married? But so the first answer is, well, people get married during the day too, so maybe not. And now the second answer is, well, do people only make love at night? Don't they make love during the day? But didn't Rava say that although the sages generally prohibited engaging in intercourse during the day, if it was in a dark house, it is permitted? And the Gemara rejects this question. No, la kasha. This is not difficult. By employing this phrase, it teaches us the ordinary mode of behavior, i.e., that intercourse generally takes place at night, so presumably the affection characteristic of the first night would include either that they had intercourse or that they stood under the canopy, and so therefore she's fully married if she stood under the canopy but didn't make it to the marriage bed. Rather, the opinion that the expression is a reference to the wedding is difficult, as a wedding does not have to take place at night. So the Gemara responds, the wedding reference is also not difficult, since a reference to a wedding without specification means a wedding that takes place. Why? In order to lead directly to the intercourse. So even if they didn't quite make it to the marriage bed, when you stand under the wedding canopy and exchange your vows, you are certainly intending to make it to the marriage bed, so they didn't practically get there. Obviously, it was the intent of the bride and groom that, they have that state of marriage when they stood under the wedding canopy, and therefore she should get the full amount, the additional amounts, not just the amounts that would accrue to her if he died or divorced during the betrothal period. So by using this phrase, it similarly teaches us the ordinary mode of behavior, i.e. that intercourse generally takes place at night. Consequently, this baraisa cannot be used as a proof for either possibility. We haven't answered the question yet. By the way, with respect to this question that the sages said, you should only make love at night, not because nighttime is the right time, but because it's dark at night. And we actually had Rabbi Manis Friedman on our show when we did a live broadcast with him. We had a conversation with him, and he said, indeed, that is the law. Not everybody follows it, but they're breaking a halacha of the sages when they make love, when a couple makes love in a lit room. You're supposed to do it in the dark. Rav Ashi asks a question similar to Ravin's. If the bride entered the wedding canopy and then she began menstruating, right? So then they're not able to consummate the union. Usually they try to arrange that the wedding will occur in the part of her cycle where after they get married, that night they can enjoy the first night as man and wife. But maybe, the cycle became irregular, and so they stood under the wedding canopy. Then she began menstruating, so now they're going to be prohibited to each other. They're man and wife, presumably, but they're going to be prohibited to each other until her period ends, and she has observed 7 clean days, and she goes to the mikvah, and then she returns that night, and like any husband and wife, that's when they become permitted to each other. So during that time when they're awaiting for her, menses to end, and that she becomes tahor again, ritually pure by the 7 days and the mikvah, are they not husband and wife? They stood under the wedding canopy, but the question being asked is, if they stood under the wedding canopy but didn't make it to the marriage bed, is she considered fully married for the purpose of this law that a wife only gets the full amount of the kesuba when they're fully married and not when they're just in a state of betrothal. So what does it say? If the bride entered the wedding canopy and began menstruating, and the husband then died without ever engaging in intercourse with his wife, what is the law with regard to the additional sum of the marriage contract? If you say that the affection manifest in the wedding affects the marriage, does this refer specifically to a wedding in which the couple is fit to engage in intercourse, which involves greater affection, and a wedding in which the couple is not fit to engage in intercourse does not affect the marriage? Or perhaps it is no different, and the sages could not answer this question, and so, taiku, the question remained unresolved. On this page, what is the law? The affection manifest in the wedding affects the marriage. Here's the law from Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, the way it's practiced. Once a betrothed woman has entered the wedding canopy, even if she has not yet engaged in sexual intercourse with her husband, she has the status of a married woman for all purposes. For example, inheritance, her ability to receive the entire sum of her marriage contract, what we're discussing here, and a priest's obligation to become impure on behalf of his wife if she dies. In all these cases, they're considered fully married once they've stepped under the wedding canopy, even if they hadn't made it to the marriage bed. However, this applies only in a case where she was permitted to engage in sexual relations when she entered the wedding canopy. If she was a menstruating woman while she's standing under the wedding canopy, she maintains the status of a betrothed woman for all purposes. The Rosh, one of the commentators, however, holds that in the latter case, the woman maintains the status of a betrothed woman only with regard to the additional sum of the marriage contract, but for all other matters, she has the status of a married woman. So there's the law. They just didn't derive it here. The Mishna states, Rabbi Yehuda says, if he wishes, he may write a marriage contract for a virgin for 200 dinars, and then she may write a receipt as if he has paid her part of that sum. In other words, they can agree, the husband and wife, to stipulate that he'll owe her less than the standard amount, less than the minimum amount that the sages demanded for the marriage contract. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says she can agree to waive part of that payment by writing a receipt stating that she's received it. Right? She's not waiving, but she is, because they're using this as a legal device to say, you've already paid me some. Even though he hasn't actually paid her, you can do this legally according to Rabbi Yehuda. That was in our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir disagrees with him. But Rabbi Yehuda says you can do this. Now they're going to question, wait a minute, is that really Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? They ask, and did Rabbi Yehuda hold that one writes a receipt for partial payment of a debt? Right? The Kesuba payment is essentially a debt. It's a debt that he will pay her if he dies, his estate will pay it, or if he divorces her, he will pay it. So it's basically a debt, and it's a debt with a lien, as we learned, on all of his property. So here what Rabbi Yehuda said in our Mishnah is that she can write a receipt for a portion of the marriage payment in order to reduce that obligation that he'll owe in the future. But didn't we learn in a Mishnah, in Tractate Bava Basra on page 170, Amud Beis, on the B side, in the case of one who repaid part of his debt, Rabbi Yehuda says he should exchange the original promissory note for a new one that states the amount still owed. And Rabbi Yosei says the lender should write him a receipt for the money that he received. So in that was it a Mishnah or a Baraisa? It was a Mishnah. So in that Mishnah in Bava Basra, right, in that debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei, Rabbi Yehuda said a new note is preferable to a receipt because if the borrower loses the receipt, the lender is still in possession of a promissory note for the full amount and can collect a second time. So it would seem that Rabbi Yehuda was being cautious, right? I lend you money. So now you give me a promissory note. I lend you $100. You write a promissory note. I hold that note. Until you pay me back the $100, I have this promissory note that I can, go to you and say, hey, you borrowed $100. Here's your promissory note. Pay me. I could sell that promissory note as well. So somebody else could be holding that note of indebtedness and come to you and say, here's the promissory note for $100. Sal gave it to me. Now you owe me $100. Pay me. So if you're going to do a partial payment, right, you're going to say, okay, I owe you $100. I can't pay it all today. I'm going to give you $50. So if I give you a receipt for the $50 that you've paid me, should you lose that receipt that you paid half of the money, I still have a promissory note that says you owe me $100. Maybe I die. Maybe my son inherits that note. He doesn't know that you paid me $50 and I gave you a receipt. So he comes to you with the promissory note that's now part of the estate and says, you owe $100, pay the $100. And you say, well, I paid Sal $50. I paid half of it. And my son would say, well, prove it. Did Sal give you a receipt? And you would say, yeah, he did give me a receipt, but I lost it. You're going to have a big problem. Rabbi Yehuda wants to avoid that situation. So he says, if I lend you $100, you give me the promissory note, later I come to you and say, pay me. You say I can only pay $50. I say, okay, give me the $50. Here's your promissory note. Either let's amend the note itself, or let's rip up the old promissory note and you'll give me a new one for $50. And then we would avoid that situation. So that would seem to indicate that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't believe that a partial payment of a debt should be evidenced by a receipt. It should only be evidenced by an amended or replaced promissory note, contrary to what he seems to be saying here in our Mishnah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the Mishnah, I guess in that Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda is referring to a case where the receipt is written, in this Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda is referring to a case where the receipt is written within the marriage contract itself and is not a separate document. He's calling it a receipt, but it's really an amended kesuba, which in this case functions like an amended promissory note. So the husband is therefore not required to hold on to a receipt, and consequently, Rabbi Yehuda's restriction against writing receipts doesn't really apply in this case of the kesuba. So Abaye said, even if you say that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the receipt is not written within the kesuba, it is logical that Rabbi Yehuda would still make an exception from his usual rule here in the case of a marriage contract. Now granted, there in the ordinary case of a receipt, it is certain that the borrower repaid part of the loan, and consequently there is concern that perhaps he will lose the receipt and the lender will take out the promissory note and return and try to collect the entire payment again. But here, in our Mishnah about the marriage contract, did the husband definitely give the wife part of the payment for the marriage contract? That's not what he did. He didn't prepay part of his marriage contract, and that's why she gave him a receipt. They're using the receipt as a legal device that she's waiving part of that amount owed in the future. So the receipt merely amounts to something that she said to him in order to waive part of the payment, although she did not actually receive it. So if the husband saved the receipt, he saved it. And if he did not save it, well, it is he himself who will lose. Therefore, in this case, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that one writes a receipt, because a kesuba, although it memorializes an amount of money that will be paid in the future, it is not the same as a promissory note. So here the receipt might work. So they ask, granted, it is understandable why Abaye did not say his explanation in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah, as the Mishnah does not teach explicitly that the receipt is written within the marriage contract. However, what is the reason that Rabbi Yirmiyah did not say an explanation in accordance with the opinion of Abaye? Why does Rabbi Yirmiyah limit the Mishnah to a case where the receipt was written within the marriage contract? Why not say, like Rabbi Yehuda, or like Abaye, that no, it would still work because a marriage contract is different than a promissory note? Why didn't Rabbi Yirmiyah say that? And the Gemara responds, although this is an unusual case, as there is no concern that the receipt may be lost, there is nevertheless a rabbinic decree with regard to this receipt due to the typical case of receipts and promissory notes, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda would not allow a receipt unless it was written into the marriage contract itself, per the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, with regard to the crux of the issue, the Gemara notes, the reason that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a wife may waive part of the kesuba amount, the main sum, that minimum sum, right? The sages, following the opinion of Rabbi Meir, said you cannot do that. You cannot get married and have a marriage contract for less than the minimum amount. But Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying you can. So why would he do that? So the reason that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the wife can waive part of the main sum of her marriage contract is specifically because she wrote him a receipt. However, if she said it verbally, no, it is not effective, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. So they're not really getting at the crux of the issue. Why is it permissible to reduce the amount? They're just still talking about how is it evidenced that, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that she may waive part of the payment. So now they're saying, okay, well, it's because she gave a written receipt, but if she made that as a verbal stipulation, it would not work. And the Gemara asks, why not? Why not allow it as a verbal stipulation? This is a monetary matter. And we have heard that Rabbi Yehuda himself said, with regard to monetary matters in which someone makes a verbal stipulation, his stipulation stands. Now you can probably hear Rabbi Yehuda would, if he was teaching this himself, would say, it is not optimal when you enter a contract on a monetary matter to evidence the agreement with a verbal stipulation. You shouldn't do that. But if someone made an oral agreement, it has to be respected. So this is as it is taught in the Tosefta in Kedushin 3:7. In the case of one who says to a woman, you are hereby betrothed to me, right? So this is at the stage of betrothal, and he's going to make a conditional betrothal. You are hereby betrothed to me on the condition that you have no ability to claim from me food, clothing, or conjugal rights. Now, I'm wondering, what? Is he saying you are betrothed to me on the condition that you cannot claim from me food, clothing, or conjugal rights during the period of the betrothal? Maybe that would work. But can he say you are betrothed to me on the condition that when we get married, you cannot claim from me food, clothing, or conjugal rights? That sounds very suspect. That sounds like it won't work. Let's see. So if he said that, you are betrothed to me on condition that you have no ability to claim from me food, clothing, or conjugal rights, she is betrothed, and his stipulation is void. The condition was no good. You made an impossible condition. So you might have thought, well, he made a condition that can never, be attached to a betrothal, so there should be no betrothal. But they're saying, no, you can't behave that way, dude. So if you're saying you are betrothed to me on condition of something that can never be attached to a betrothal, what you did is you said, you are betrothed to me. And everything that came afterward in the possible condition was like nothing. It was like air. It had no meaning. So she is betrothed to him. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, with regard to monetary matters such as food and clothing, his stipulation stands. Therefore, if she verbally waives part of the marriage contract and thereby makes a stipulation about a monetary matter, it should be effective. Whereas the part of the condition that she would waive her right even in the marriage to conjugal rights, that is impossible, and even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that is just void. That is not part of the condition. But Rabbi Yehuda would say you can waive. A woman can marry a man on condition that she will not be supported by him, right? No food or clothing from him. She'll have to bring enough wealth into the marriage or have a job, and she's not going to be dependent on him. Nice guy, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, that would work. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda holds, the marriage contract itself, right, that a man must give a woman a kesubah at the time that they're getting married, that is a rabbinic law. The Torah doesn't say anything about a kesubah, right? There's no marriage contract mentioned in the Torah. The sages decreed that a man must give a marriage contract. They created this legal device. Why? To protect women. Because men have that unilateral right to divorce a woman. they made it very difficult for, he'd have to think twice before divorcing his wife. He can't just do that casually. That's why they created the Kesubah. So therefore, if the wife waives part of the main sum of the marriage contract, Rabbi Yehuda holds that her declaration has no force unless it is written down. However, a Torah obligation, such as food and clothing, does not require this reinforcement, and consequently, the wife may waive it with a verbal stipulation. Now, here you see, wait. Are you saying that a rabbinic decree is enforced in a more rigid manner than a Torah law? Wouldn't we expect it's the opposite? Isn't this counterintuitive until you remember why they did this? And they'll say more about it. But the sages built sort of stiffer laws to ensure that rabbinic decrees are followed, including giving lashes if someone doesn't do it, because rabbinic decrees require reinforcement. Everyone agrees that if it's a written law in the Torah, you got to do it, and no one really argues with that. But when the sages added to the halachas, to the laws that bind Jews, in order to protect them from transgressing Torah laws, that's why rabbinic decrees were always there, right? This rabbinic decree is to preserve marriage, which is by Torah law, but because the Kesubah itself is by rabbinic decree, it requires reinforcement so people will follow it, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda would say, you can waive part of it, but you have to do it in writing. Whereas something that is by Torah law, that the husband owes her food and clothing, she can waive it by verbal stipulation and it will hold up. Now the Gemara challenges this answer. Whoa. The husband's entitlement, and he's going to give, and they're going to use a different body of law within marriage to prove it. The husband's entitlement to the produce of his wife's property is a rabbinic decree, right? She brings property into the marriage. If the marriage ends, she's going to take that property out of the marriage with her. But while they are married, the husband is entitled to the produce of that property, right? So if they get married, she brings a field with her, and they plant that field. So then during the marriage, the produce of that field, right, the crops that come every year, that is, the value of that gets added to the husband's property, to the husband's estate. But the field itself actually remains the wife's, and when the marriage ends, she takes it back with her. But this idea that he's entitled to the produce, okay, what about it? The husband's entitlement to the produce of his wife's property is a rabbinic decree. And nevertheless, the sages did not reinforce his rights to them. As we learned in a Mishna on 83a of this book, Rabbi Yehuda says, even if the husband wrote that he waived his rights to the produce of his wife's property, he may actually consume the produce of the produce of her property, meaning that he could invest the produce in additional property, which would also belong to his wife, but he would consume its produce. And this applies unless he explicitly writes to her, I do not have any claim to your property, its produce, or the produce of its produce forever. And we maintain on this issue, what is the meaning of rights? It sounds like, what do you mean? They are reinforcing the rabbinic decree by saying that it only can be waived if it's in writing. But what is the meaning of rights? It means says. A verbal stipulation will suffice. In order to relinquish one's claim to produce of the produce of his wife's property, he does not necessarily need to write this in a document. It is sufficient to say it verbally in front of witnesses, and then the husband would have waived his right to the produce of his wife's property, even though it was only done by verbal stipulation. And then from then on, he is not entitled to the produce of his wife's property. He could waive it by a verbal stipulation. So presumably Rabbi Yehuda would hold that she can waive part of the sum of her even standard or minimum marriage contract with a verbal stipulation. And it doesn't have to be in writing, which seems to be the gist of what was said before. We're on 56b, by the way. Abaye said, there is a distinction between the two cases where the husband waives his right to the produce of her property by verbal stipulation versus where the wife waives part of her minimum marriage contract by verbal stipulation. What's the distinction? Every married woman has a marriage contract, But not all husbands have the right to produce, as not every woman brings property with her into the marriage. Therefore, in relation to a common matter, such as a marriage contract, the sages reinforce their pronouncements about it by insisting that any stipulations to change the terms must be in writing. However, with regard to an uncommon matter, such as the produce of her property, the sages did not reinforce the pronouncements about it, and a verbal declaration is sufficient. Now, the Gemara challenges this answer. But with regard to the law of donkey drivers, which is a common matter, Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that the sages reinforced their pronouncements about it. And this is as we learned in a Mishna, tractate Demai, Mishna, tractate of the Mishna, Demai 4:7. In the case of donkey drivers who entered a city to sell their wares, and one of them said, "My produce is from the new crop and is still moist and not as good, but my associate's produce is from the old crop." Or he said, "Mine is not fit for use because it has not been tithed, but this other donkey driver, his produce is fit for use." These donkey drivers, are not afforded credibility. We don't believe them. There is a suspicion that they may be lying. They may have conspired, and they have an arrangement between them where one will make this statement in one city. You might think that if he's saying, "Look, my stuff is not as good as his, you should buy from him," he must be telling the truth. But they might be working together, and in this city, the guy says, "My stuff is not as good, buy from him," and in the next city, that guy will say, "My stuff is not as good, buy from him." And they're lying, right? They're just trying to increase sales. So because there is a suspicion that they may be lying, that they might have an arrangement between them where one will make the statement in one city, and in the next city, they will make alternate statements in order to appear credible, so that one will always be able to sell his wares. We don't believe them. So Rabbi Yehuda says they are deemed credible. And this indicates that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a verbal stipulation is sufficient even for a common monetary matter like selling wares in the marketplace. Right? So let's just review where we are. We're debating whether Rabbi Yehuda accepts that she can waive part of her standard marriage contract and bring it below that minimum threshold. First of all, he says that in our Mishnah, but in this debate, they're saying, well, he only says that because she would give a receipt in writing. The first opinion, by amending the Kesubah itself. Second opinion, by giving a written receipt. Third opinion, even a verbal stipulation would be enough. And now they're saying, well, Rabbi Yehuda would never accept a verbal stipulation in a matter such as this. And the others are saying, well, in other cases, Rabbi Yehuda does accept a verbal stipulation. So which is it? Abaye said there is a distinction between the cases with regard to a certain matter involving a rabbinic decree, such as the main sum of the marriage contract. The sages reinforced their pronouncements, so it could only be waived in writing. But with regard to an uncertain matter involving a rabbinic decree, such as the case of the donkey drivers, the sages did not reinforce their pronouncements, right? Because in a case of uncertainty upon uncertainty, they don't issue extra decrees. So Rava said the sages did not reinforce their pronouncements in the case of donkey drivers because, in general, they were lenient about questions concerning the prohibition of doubtfully tithed produce, demai, since the law of demai is itself a stringency, right? Demai means if you buy produce from an am haaretz, from an ignoramus, right? From somebody that you can't be sure that he knows the law, the Jewish law, about tithing produce. You can't be sure that he tithed it already. So this is demai, produce with the tithing was uncertain. So then you have to be stringent, and then you tithe it after you've bought it, just because you can't be sure if it's tithe produce or not. But that is a rabbinic decree, not a Torah law. This case of uncertain produce, whether it was tithe or not. So since it's a case of uncertainty, you're not going to issue additional decrees where you're having an uncertainty upon an uncertainty. New subject. The Mishnah says, so we know that Rabbi Yehuda allows the woman to waive part of her amount. We're not sure if he says that because it's in writing or even with a verbal stipulation, but in any case, the law is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The law is like Rabbi Meir, that she cannot waive part of that minimum amount. She's always entitled to that. whether she gives a receipt or not. So the Mishnah says, our Mishnah says, Rabbi Meir says, in the case of anyone who reduces the amount of the marriage contract to less than 200 dinars for a virgin or 100 dinars for a widow, this marriage amounts to licentious sexual intercourse, right? We learned that yesterday. So the Gemara makes an inference from the language of the Mishnah. In other words, because they didn't give a proper kesuba, it's not a proper marriage, and if they're not living together as husband and wife, who are not properly married, that's what makes it licentious sexual intercourse. The Gemara makes an inference from the language of the Mishnah. The phrase, anyone who reduces the amount of the marriage contract, means even if he made a stipulation and she agreed. Apparently, Rabbi Meir held that his stipulation in this case is void, and she has the ability to collect the entire amount set by the sages. But nevertheless, since he said to her, you have only 100 dinars, she does not rely on the marriage contract and does not see it as a true marriage, and therefore the intercourse becomes licentious sexual intercourse. They cannot reduce the amount. But since she agreed to get married on a promise that was less than the normal amount, it's like she has no marriage contract at all. And now you can really see why it would be deemed licentious sexual intercourse. They didn't get married, right? There was no proper marriage with a proper ketubah. But we have heard that Rabbi Meir said that anyone who stipulates counter to that which is written in the Torah, his stipulation is void. So this implies that if someone makes a stipulation on a rabbinic law, his stipulation does stand. And therefore, there is still a question as to why the stipulation about the marriage contract is void, as a marriage contract is a rabbinic ordinance. It should be that the stipulation stands, but because it's for a kesuba less than the amount, that's what makes it licentious sexual intercourse if they now live together as man and woman based on, a kesuba that was reduced beneath the minimum amount. And the Gemara responds, Rabbi Meir holds that a marriage contract is a requirement of Torah law. It's not, but he says the Torah requires a proper marriage, and this is what makes it a proper marriage. So even though the Torah doesn't spell out that a kesuba is necessary, it is by Torah law. That's a minority opinion. Consequently, if one made a stipulation to reduce the amount of the marriage contract, this is a stipulation counter to that which is written in the Torah, and it's a meaningless statement. So it is taught in a baraisa. And so you would think, well, then why is it licentious sexual intercourse, right? If he has said something that is counter to Torah law, he has said nothing at all. So it doesn't matter that she agreed to a smaller amount and he tried to stipulate a smaller amount. That doesn't mean anything. He still owes the full amount in case that he dies or they're divorced. And therefore, it should be a completely valid marriage and is not licentious sexual intercourse, right? Wouldn't you think? It is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Meir says, in the case of anyone who reduces the amount of the marriage contract to lower than 200 dinars for a virgin or 100 dinars for a widow, this marriage amounts to licentious sexual intercourse, same as in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yosei says, one is permitted to reduce the amount by making a verbal stipulation, provided the wife agrees. Rabbi Yehuda says, if one wishes, he may write for a virgin a document of 200 dinars, and she may write him a receipt stating, I received 100 dinars from you. Or similarly for a widow, he may say, I give you a marriage contract with 100, and she gives a receipt, I already received 50. Right? The Bryce is just like our Mishnah, except it has this opinion of Rabbi Yosei in the middle, which I don't think appeared in our Mishnah. Right? Nope. So what's different about the Bryce is that Rabbi Yosei says she can even waive it with a verbal stipulation. The Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yosei actually hold that he is permitted to reduce the amount? The Gemara raises a contradiction based on another baraisa. Collection of a woman's marriage contract may not be made dependent upon movable property. This is a rabbinic decree enacted for the betterment of the world. Rabbi Yosei said, what betterment of the world is accomplished by this decree? And the Gemara answers, the price of the movable property is not fixed, and therefore it might become devalued, right? A wife has a lien on all of her husband's property, whatever is necessary to take from that property. If he dies, she can go to the estate and say, well, sell whatever you need to sell, because you have to pay me the marriage contract, and if you don't, I will seize that property. She can collect from land. She can collect from movable property. She can collect from any of his property. If they stipulated in the marriage contract, no, she can only collect from movable property, and maybe even from this specific movable property. That's nothing. That stipulation is void because movable property, like produce, could go up in value or it could go down in value. And then it might end up being worth less than that minimum amount. And it would be no good. That's why she has a lien on all his property. The Gemara analyzes the text of the Baraisa. The first Tana also said a marriage contract may not be made dependent on movable property. What is Rabbi Yosef's disagreement with him? Rather, is it not that this is what the first Tana said? In what cases this statement said? In a case where one did not provide a guarantee for the movable property. But if one did provide a guarantee, then the marriage contract may be made dependent on movable property, right? You can say, I promise you 200 dinars as your marriage contract in case I die or we are divorced, and you can take it from this movable property. That would be no good. That would be a void statement. But he would also say, and I guarantee the value of that movable property with my fields. So you have to go to the movable property first. If that's insufficient to pay the contract, then you can go to my real estate, right? To my real property. So maybe that would be okay. So in a case where one did not provide a guarantee for the movable property, it would work. But if one did provide a guarantee, the marriage contract may be made dependent on it. And Rabbi Yosef comes to say, even if one provided a guarantee, why can the marriage contract be made dependent on it? The price is not fixed, and it may become devalued, and we shouldn't tie the marriage contract payment to something that could become devalued. Now that the meaning of the Baraisa has been clarified, the Gemara asks, so can we use this Baraisa to prove what we're arguing about? Can we reduce the amount? Just as there in the case of movable property, where perhaps it will be devalued, Rabbi Yosef is concerned that the wife might not receive the full value of her marriage contract. Here, where it will definitely be devalued because she's giving away part of her right to it, she could, he's asked, Rabbi Yosef seems to be saying she can stipulate, okay, I received half, even though she didn't. And so the husband's estate will only owe half the amount, or the husband himself if he divorces her. Here, where it will definitely be devalued, is it not all the more so clear that Rabbi Yosef would be concerned? And the Gemara responds, how can you compare these cases? There, she does not know if her marriage contract will be devalued, and there is no reason to suppose that she will waive his obligation to her. But here, she knows it will be devalued, and she agreed to waive it. How can you compare that? She's not saying that she will waive anything. It's just that Rabbi Yosef is concerned that what will be used to pay her might become devalued. But where she herself agrees to waive part of it, why not allow her to do that? The Gemara relates, the sister of Rami Bar Chama was married to Rav Avia. Now we're getting to a real incident. Her marriage contract was lost. Now we're on 57a. We're just going to do a little bit here to get to a natural stopping point. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. Her marriage contract was lost. And the woman and her husband came before Rav Yosef to ask what they should do. They lost the marriage contract. He said to them, this is what Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said. That ruling, that if someone reduces his wife's marriage contract by even a small amount, their marriage amounts to licentious sexual intercourse, is the statement of Rabbi Meir. According to that opinion, and it's the majority opinion, the husband and wife were forbidden to each other because she was not in possession of what? A valid marriage contract. So you would think, if you're saying that the Rabbi Meir is calling it licentious sexual intercourse because she agreed to a contract that was not a valid marriage contract, and that's why they're living together as if they're not really married, that's what makes it licentious. Now that you people have lost your marriage contract, well, clearly she's not in possession of a valid marriage contract, so you're in a bad way. You need to replace that contract right away. But the rabbis say, since the woman relies on the fact that she will eventually collect payment for her marriage contract, a man may maintain his wife for as long as 2 or 3 years without a written marriage contract. Just because they lost the ketubah or the kesuba doesn't mean that they're now living in a state, they're just living together as if they're not married. They just lost the marriage contract. They need to replace it. But it's not an emergency. They just need to do it, soon. There is no urgent need to write a new one since the husband's obligation remains intact. Abaye said to him, but didn't Rav Nachman say that Shmuel said that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir with regard to all of his decrees? Since Rabbi Meir's statement about the marriage contract was a form of decree, the law should be in accordance with his opinion. And Rav Yosef responded, okay, if so, go and write her a new marriage contract. What is the law? If someone wrote a marriage contract for his wife and it was lost, or she waived her right to the payment for the marriage contract by writing a receipt stating that he had paid her, he must write her another document for at least the main sum of the marriage contract. You can never go below that. And so if it's lost, you need to write a new one right away. If you want to reduce it less than what he originally promised to some lesser amount than that, but still at least the standard amount, 200 dinars for a virgin, 100 for one who entered marriage as a non-virgin, then you have to write a new one. She must have that ketubah in her possession. Why? As a man is prohibited from living with his wife for even a short time without a marriage contract. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as the law is in accordance with all of his decrees. If you've lost your kesubah, you got to make a new one. That's what we just learned. All right, let's check comments and questions. On page 56, here in Tractate Kesubos. Bill, they may indeed be breaking the halacha, the law, by making love with the lights on, but given the sages have in the past declined to issue edicts they knew would not be followed, let us say, if I had a time machine, I may have counseled the sages to remain silent on the issue. Is this enforceable in any way? When I said his name earlier in the show, and now I'm spacing on it. The rabbi with the long white beard. When he was on our show, what he said is, it's the law that husbands and wives should make love in the dark. And it is wise that they make love in the dark. It is wise. It is not only legally required, according to this law that we heard, but it is wise for husbands and wives to do that. Now, the sages also said that a husband and wife can kind of do anything that they want to, in the bedroom in terms of the forms of sex that they have. So, you're supposed to do it in the dark. That's what we learned today. You're supposed to do it in the dark. We'll just leave it at that. Man is Friedman. Thank you, honey. I can't believe I spaced on Rabbi Friedman's name. Ifa. Since consummation of a wedding happens in private, one can never be sure when or if that happened. All that can be known is that they went under the huppah. Should that be what counts? Excellent question, right? Because when you're talking about marriage, there's the personal, private, intimate aspect of it and the rights and obligations that they have vis-a-vis each other. But the reason that weddings are conducted in public and they are witnessed is because they also have an impact on the community, and it assures that any children born from that union have a status of legitimate children who can marry any other Jew. They're not mamzers who are conceived out of wedlock, right? So that, I think you make an excellent point, and that should be the reason, and perhaps that is the reason that we learn what the law is, that once they stand under the chuppah, whether they've made love or not, they're considered fully married. So good point. Ruth, does this apply to items like pension, assets, or does it remain in the woman's control? I think you're talking about, does she have her rights to her own pension, right? She worked, she earned, it's her pension. Does the husband have a right to that? Now, a lot of these kinds of questions in modern times are handled basically with more detailed kesubos, right? Because the ketubah is like a prenuptial agreement, is what it really is. And you can write other terms into it. So part of that could be covered in there, right? Like she brings property in, she's going to leave with that property. If that property is an income stream, like a pension, that's hers. While they're married, it's more like communal property, right? Like he has a right to it, just as she has a right to be supported by his income stream. But if they divorce, she takes her pension with her for sure. Sharon, what if a couple truly choose to marry one another, but the husband is not in a position to fully pay the typical ketubah amount? I'm not clear on why they cannot opt for a lower amount. Well, right, remember, it's not a bride price, right? He's not paying, like, it's not like he's coming to pay the father a certain amount of money so that he can marry the daughter. He may have to do that, but that has nothing to do with the kesubah. The kesubah is to protect her if the marriage should end. Now, that could be way in the future, right? So why waive that? Why waive that? If this guy's not willing to step up and say, I'm marrying you, I'm intending to marry you for life, I hope that at some point in the future, I'll be able to support you and have an estate that would be able, to pay the kesubah at the time that I die or that we're divorced. That's a pretty reasonable ask. Like the kesubah amount was substantial, but it wasn't crazy. It wasn't forcing, people to, become slave laborers at their jobs just to earn enough money so that they could eventually pay that off. Why would she waive that amount? Like we've been discussing it. Can she waive? Can she not waive? I mean, she can't waive the standard amount. That's what the sages said, right? The Rabbi Yehuda says yes, but the majority opinion is no. You're asking, well, why not hold like Rabbi Yehuda? She's willing to agree to it. Maybe she's anticipating that she's marrying a lifelong student who's never going to get rich, and he can't in good conscience say that he'll ever have enough money to pay properly, so he doesn't want to lie about it. And he says, let's just waive that. No. But the sages are protecting the women, and so they're not going to let her waive that because it's so much to her detriment. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, for page 57 at the regular time, 6 p.m.